I keep a log. Not out of discipline, God knows I've never had much of that, but out of a particular anxiety I developed somewhere around my 4th year of range work, the creeping suspicion that if I didn't write things down, I'd lose them. Days bleed together out here. One brown horizon swallows the next. A man can ride for a week and feel like he hasn't moved an inch, and if he isn't careful, he starts to wonder whether he exists at all, whether the dust and the silence haven't quietly dissolved him while he wasn't paying attention. So I write things down, little things, the color of a sunset, the exact way a horse favors its left foreleg after a long pull uphill, the smell of a particular canyon in the hour before rain. My boss, Aldrich Crane, thinks it's ridiculous. He calls it my schoolgirl diary. I let him call it that because Aldrich is a practical man, and practical men don't understand the need to record themselves into existence, and I've never found a way to explain it that didn't sound faintly desperate. The entry I made on the morning of October the 14th, 1887, reads like this. Fever broke sometime in the night, creek bed, can't feel my left hand, someone is here. That's all I managed. The pencil fell, I didn't pick it up. What I remember of the previous 11 days arrives in fragments, the way bad memories tend to, not in order, not with any mercy for context. I remember the horse going lame 3 days out of Tucson. I remember the water I carried running out faster than I'd calculated because I'd miscounted the days. A stupid, preventable error that I replayed 100 times in the burning midday heat of what I later determined was the Aravaipa corridor. I remember deciding to follow a dry creek bed west because dry creek beds occasionally become wet ones if you follow them long enough. And I remember being wrong about that. And I remember the particular quality of hopelessness that arrives when you've been wrong about something that matters. I remember the fever arriving like a slow tide. First the chills, which seemed absurd in the 105-degree afternoon. Then the heat that followed, which seemed even more absurd because it was entirely internal, a fire in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. I remember crawling under a ledge of rock when I couldn't walk anymore, and I remember the strange, dissociated calm that replaced the panic. The way the mind, when it's run out of options, stops arguing and just watches. I thought a lot of things in that ledge under that rock. Some of them were prayers. Some of them were apologies to people I'd wronged in small ways and never gotten around to addressing. Some of them were just the names of foods I wanted to eat. A lunatic inventory. Salt pork, cornbread, 3 eggs fried hard in lard, the particular beef stew my mother made every winter that smelled of bay leaf, and something else she never told me. A secret ingredient she took to her grave in the way women of her generation took certain things, quietly, without drama, as if privacy were a form of dignity. I don't know exactly when she found me. I know that at some point the interior of the ledge changed, the quality of the shadow shifted, and I registered a human presence the way animals register it, before the brain processes it as a change in the air pressure, a warmth that wasn't the rock's stored heat. When I turned my head, she was crouching at the ledge entrance. Just crouching there, studying me the way you study something you're not sure about, not frightened, not aggressive, assessing. She was Apache. I understood that immediately, and I want to be precise about what that understanding felt like in 1887 Arizona, because it matters to the story. It wasn't fear exactly, though I won't pretend fear wasn't somewhere in the proximity. I'd been raised on certain narratives, breathed in certain assumptions with the same unconscious regularity I'd breathed in dust and horse smell, and those things don't vanish the moment you decide you're a reasonable man. They sit in the back of the body, in the shoulders and the gut, and they move before thought does. What I mostly felt, if I'm honest, was too weak for fear to fully organize itself. The fever had used up most of my available responses. What was left was something simpler, a recognition that another person was present, and that another person being present meant I was not entirely alone in the dying. She had a clay bowl. I noticed the bowl before I noticed anything else about her. The shape of it, rough-sided and dark, fired at a temperature that left the surface matte rather than glossy, functional rather than decorative. She held it in both hands, steady, the way you hold something that is hot but not unbearably so, with a measured respect for the heat rather than a flinch from it. Whatever was in it steamed. In October in Arizona, in a shaded creek bed, something steaming meant it was genuinely hot, freshly made, which meant she had made it nearby, which meant she had been nearby for long enough to make it. That thought, that she had been close, watching, deciding, should have alarmed me. It arrived as something closer to wonder. She extended the bowl. Not a push, not an offering with strings visible, just an extension, an arm held forward, a clay bowl at the end of it. I stared at it. She waited. Here is what I understood in the slow-moving way that fever allows for understanding. I was going to die in this creek bed if I didn't eat something. I had already processed this. The mathematical version of my situation was not complicated, and here was a bowl of something hot. Here is the other thing I understood beneath the first thing, quieter. I didn't know what was in the bowl. I didn't know this woman. Everything about the last 11 days of my life had been the consequence of assumptions I'd made with incomplete information, and every one of those assumptions had cost me something. The horse, the water, the days. I was being asked to make another assumption. I took the bowl. The smell hit before the taste, a dense, layered smell that I couldn't immediately parse into components the way you can with a familiar dish. There was something herbal in it, pungent and slightly bitter, the kind of smell that lives at the back of the sinuses rather than the front. There was fat of some kind, an animal fat, rich and coating. There was a dried fruit quality, not sweetness exactly, more like sweetness after it has been through something difficult and come out the other side more complex. I drank it. I want to say I ate it, but the consistency was closer to a thick broth than a solid meal, so drinking is more accurate. I drank it in the way a man drinks when he has been afraid he would never drink again, greedily and then as the warmth spread slowly with something approaching reverence. She watched me finish it. When I lowered the bowl, my hands were steadier than they'd been in days. I don't know whether this was medicine or food, or simply the placebo of being cared for when you had resigned yourself to dying unattended, and I couldn't have told you in that moment which of those three things would have been more valuable. I looked at her properly for the first time. She was older than I'd initially registered, not old, but settled into her age in a way that some people manage and most don't, a quality of having arrived somewhere and decided to stay. She wore a cloth dress, not the buckskin I'd been conditioned to expect by dime novels I'd read as a younger fool, but a faded cotton dress that had been mended in several places with thread that didn't quite match the original color. Her hair was pulled back and wrapped, and she had a scar along her left jaw, a pale seam of old damage running from the ear toward the chin. She wasn't looking at me with pity. That's the thing I remember most clearly, and it surprised me more than the food had. There was assessment in her gaze and patience, and something I might call guardedness if I were being neutral about it, but there was no pity. I was accustomed to being the capable one, the man who knew his territory, who could read weather and tracks and the mood of a herd. Here I was, collapsed in a rock ledge, fever broke and barely functional, and the person looking at me was not adjusting downward. She was just looking at me at whatever level I actually occupied. I found that I preferred it. "Who are you really?" I whispered. I didn't plan to say it. It came out the way things come out when you've been alone for 11 days, and your social filtering has dissolved along with everything else that requires energy to maintain. It came out as the truest question my brain could produce in that moment, which is perhaps why it embarrassed me immediately after, too naked, too direct. The kind of question that makes the person asking it sound either very wise or very unwell, and I was certain which one applied. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the empty bowl, stood in a single fluid motion, and walked back up the creek bed without a word. She came back at dusk. I know this because I was conscious enough by then to notice the color of the sky, a deepening orange that turned the creek bed walls amber, and then red, and then a dark, cooling purple. I'd managed to sit up. I'd found my log and written the 4 words I mentioned at the start. I'd tried to do an inventory of my condition, and concluded that my left hand had pins and needles rather than actual numbness, which meant circulation rather than damage, which was good news I couldn't fully celebrate because the rest of me still felt like something that had been wrung out and set to dry. She came with another bowl and something wrapped in dry leaves, a flatbread of some kind, dense, grained with something I couldn't identify, slightly charred at one edge. She set these things down beside me without ceremony, and then sat across the narrow width of the creek bed, her back against the opposite wall, as if she'd decided to stay. I ate the bread slowly because my stomach was still uncertain of itself. She sat and watched the darkening sky. "Do you speak English?" I asked. A pause, then some. "Then maybe you can tell me." I stopped. because what I wanted to ask felt presumptuous now that she'd confirmed she could actually understand me. In the space where I'd imagined a language barrier, I'd been comfortable wondering out loud. The confirmation that I was legible to her made me suddenly, absurdly, conscious of every word. "You are going to die," she said, not as accusation and not as comfort, just a statement of observed fact, the way you might say it was raining or the horse was lame. "Fever and thirst together, that's a quick road." "Yes," I said, I was aware. "The bowl had chaparral and desert willow bark," she said, "for the fever, and chia seeds ground into the broth for the muscle. You were shaking too much." "I absorbed this. You know medicine." "I know plants." She looked at me then, a direct look. "There's a difference." There was, I heard it. "My name is Elias," I said. "Elias Cutter. I work for the Crane outfit out of Tucson." She didn't offer her name. She looked at the sky again. "Why did you help me?" I asked. It came out more blunt than I intended, but I was still operating at the level of basic honesty that illness enforces and social convention can't quite reach. She didn't answer for so long that I thought the conversation was over. Then she said, without looking at me, "Because the bowl was there and you were thirsty." It was not a satisfying answer. It was not meant to be a satisfying answer. I was beginning to understand that about her, that she said exactly as much as she meant and stopped, and that the stopping was not rudeness but something more like precision. She didn't pad her meanings with softening words. She cut to the bone of a thing and left the bone there, and you could pick it up or you could leave it, but she wasn't going to dress it for you. I wrote in my log, "She says her name like it costs something. I don't know yet what it costs." That night she slept on her side of the creek bed and I slept on mine. Or tried to sleep. My brain had recovered enough to start cataloging my situation in the way it does when the crisis is past and the accounting begins. I was 3 or 4 days from any settlement I knew of, on foot, with no horse and limited supplies. My employer would assume I was dead or had abandoned the job, neither assumption serving my interests. The woman who had saved my life would not tell me her name, and I found, turning this over in the dark, that the omission bothered me in a way that was entirely disproportionate to its practical significance. What did it mean to be helped by someone who wouldn't identify themselves? In my world, the world of contracts and wages and men who shook hands and named themselves with a handshake, assistance came with context. You knew who owed whom what. The transaction was legible. This wasn't a transaction. I couldn't make it one. She had given me medicine and bread and the use of a wall to sleep against, and she'd wanted nothing that I could identify, and I didn't know what to do with that. I wrote second bowl, bread. She calls herself nothing. She is neither asking for anything nor signaling what she wants from this situation. I have no category for her. I looked at that last line for a while. I have no category for her. That was honest, at least. That was the most honest thing I'd written in months. By morning she was already awake, crouching by a small fire she'd built in the sheltered curve of the creek bank where the smoke would dissipate into the rock overhang rather than rise visibly above it. She was cooking something over the fire in a small iron pot, an incongruous object, that pot, clearly not Apache in origin, the kind of thing that gets traded or taken or found or bought or gifted across all the complicated borders that exist between one people and another. I didn't ask where she'd gotten it. I sat beside the fire because my body was cold in the morning way that follows a long fever, that specific vulnerability where the body hasn't yet remembered how to regulate itself and depends too heavily on external warmth. She stirred the pot. I watched her hands. They were, I noticed, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, not roughened in the abused way of someone who has no choice, but in the capable way of someone who has chosen to be useful, who has made an ongoing accommodation with physical labor and arrived at something like fluency. She stirred with an economy of motion that was somehow both expert and absent-minded, the way a musician plays a scale they've played 10,000 times. "Do you live nearby?" I asked. "Not anymore," she said. I waited for more didn't come. The thing in the pot turned out to be a grain I didn't recognize, cooked until it had softened into a porridge consistency, with dried berries of some kind mixed through it and something else, something savory underneath the berry sweetness, a depth that I kept trying to identify and couldn't. I ate it from a second clay bowl she produced from a worn leather bag, and I ate it without asking what it was, because I had begun to understand that asking this woman what something was before you'd experienced it yourself was somehow contrary to the spirit of how she operated. She watched me taste it. The watchfulness wasn't performance. She wasn't waiting for compliments. She was assessing something, reading my response the way a doctor reads a patient's face while they describe a symptom. Looking for information. "What's the flavor I can't name?" I asked. "Under the berries." She looked at me with something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. A slight adjustment in her expression. The way a door opens a fraction when someone knocks it differently than expected. "Juniper ash," she said. "Burns it down slow, changes the grain, better for your stomach after a fever." You planned the whole meal around what my stomach could handle. She stirred the pot, though it didn't need stirring anymore. You were sick. What else would I plan it around? I stayed in the creek bed for 3 more days. I told myself this was practical. I needed strength before attempting the walk back, and she seemed willing to continue the strange, temporary arrangement we'd stumbled into. These were both true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth, which I wrote in my log late on the 2nd day, and then nearly tore the page out before deciding to leave it, was this: I am not ready to stop being in the company of someone who asks nothing of me. She fed me 3 times a day with a consistency that felt architectural, not out of obligation, not with the performance of generosity, but with the same focused attention she gave to everything. The fire, the creek bed for any sign of change, the sky for weather, the rocks for whatever rocks might tell you if you knew how to ask. She moved through her environment the way someone moves through a room they built themselves, with ownership that isn't pride but simply familiarity. On the 2nd evening I asked her directly, "What's your name?" She looked at me for a moment. "Why does it matter?" "It doesn't," I said, "and it does." Another long pause, then Saya. She said it like she was testing the air with it, like she was checking whether it would survive contact with me. I didn't know then that she had not said that name out loud to anyone in over 2 years. I wouldn't know that until the 3rd part of this story, when she told me under circumstances neither of us would have predicted, in a place neither of us would have chosen. But I wrote it down that night, very carefully at the top of a clean page. Saya. And then below it, the question I couldn't stop asking. What does she put in the bowl that I can't name? Not the chaparral, not the chia, not the juniper ash. Something else. Something I keep tasting at the back of everything she makes that isn't an ingredient at all. I fell asleep before I figured it out. On the morning of the 4th day, I told her I was strong enough to leave. She was breaking camp, a process that was nearly invisible since she had barely disturbed the creek bed in the first place, traveling so lightly that her presence was more meteorological than physical, a change in atmosphere rather than accumulation of objects. She folded things into that worn leather bag with the same economy she brought to everything. I stood with my log tucked under my arm and my hat back on my head, and my legs still somewhat uncertain beneath me but functional, and I was aware of standing at the edge of something that didn't have a name I'd been given. "I should compensate you," I said, because I had some coins and no other language for this situation. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the very beginning, from the entrance to the ledge, with that neutral, assessing gaze that contained neither cruelty nor warmth, but something more durable than either. "No," she said. "Then I stopped. I should at least know where you're going, in case I need to find you." "Why would you need to find me?" I looked at the empty bowl she'd packed away. I looked at the clean fire site, no ash left visible. The rocks replaced so exactly in their original positions that you couldn't tell anything had burned there. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. She slung the leather bag over her shoulder. She looked at me once more, and I saw something move behind her eyes, something complicated and old and not entirely readable. And then it was gone, or she had chosen to take it back, and what remained was that steady, even gaze. She walked north, up the creek bed, without another word. I watched her until she was out of sight. Then I turned south, toward the settlements, toward Aldrich Crane and the job I'd been gone from too long, toward all the things I'd been before 11 days of desert and a fever, and a clay bowl had rearranged something in the back of my chest. I wrote in my log while I walked, which is a ridiculous thing to do, and I've done it my entire adult life. The meal I cannot name, the woman who gave it, both are still with me. I don't think either is finished. I was right about that. I was not right about nearly enough else. 3 weeks later, they were going to hang her. I found out the way you find out most things in a territory town in 1887, by walking into a saloon and catching a conversation already in progress. The kind of conversation where no one is trying to be discreet, because discretion implies you might be wrong and everyone in the room had already decided they were right. The name I heard was not Saya. The name they used was the Apache woman, which was how she would have been referred to in any official document, in any newspaper account, in any telegram sent to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott. The Apache woman who had been found camping on the edge of the Harker Ranch land and was believed to have stolen from the Harker supply store 3 weeks prior. The Apache woman who had been caught by 2 of Harker's men when she came back to the creek. My creek bed. I sat down very slowly on a bar stool and asked for water, which caused the bartender to look at me with professional pity, and I listened to the rest. There'd been no trial arranged. The Harker operation had its own economy of justice in that stretch of the territory, and Frank Harker had decided the matter didn't require the inconvenience of a circuit judge. The hanging was planned for the following morning, which was a Wednesday, which I remember because I'd noted it in my log that morning as the date I planned to resupply and continue back to the Crane outfit, who had not in fact given me up for dead, but had received a delayed telegram from Tucson and were apparently annoyed rather than grieving. I sat at the bar for a considerable amount of time. I want to describe what I did with that time honestly, because I've been tempted looking back to make myself sound more certain than I was. The truth is I sat there and thought about all the ways that what I was contemplating was not my business. She had helped me and walked away. We owed each other nothing. I was a range worker for a different operation entirely, with no legal standing in the Harker territory and no particular influence with men like Frank Harker, who I had never met but knew by type. The kind of man who has mistaken the extent of his land for the extent of his authority and has never once been corrected. I thought about Aldrich Crane's annoyance. I thought about my legs, which were still not entirely dependable. I thought about the coins in my pocket, which were not many. Then I thought about the bowl. Not the taste of it exactly, not the specific herbs. I thought about the attention behind the bowl, the careful reading of my condition, the architecture of what she gave me and when and how, the absence of any demand for recognition or gratitude or even basic identification. The way she had fed me like it was simply the correct response to a man being hungry and sick, without editorializing it into charity. I thought, what kind of person does that, and what does it cost them when the world decides they're a thief? I left before I finished the water. The Harker holdings were 4 miles from the town, which gave me 4 miles of dark road to revise my plan approximately 9 times. The final version of the plan, by the time the buildings came into view, was approximately this. I had no plan. I had a log and a coat pocket, and a name I'd been given like a tested coin, and that was what I was bringing into the situation. There were 2 men by the outbuilding where she was being held. I assumed the outbuilding from the locked door and the lamp burning inside it at a time when everything else on the property was dark. I circled wide and came at it from the creek-facing side, where the bank gave me some cover, and I crouched in the near dark and tried to assess what I was actually doing. My log entry from that night, written later from memory, because I obviously couldn't write it while crouching in the dark trying not to breathe audibly, says, I had approximately $7, a pencil, and 3 years' worth of stories about my own competence. None of these seemed adequate. I went anyway. What happened in the next 2 hours is something I've written down and crossed out and rewritten more times than I can count, because the truth of it doesn't have the clean lines of the version I was briefly tempted to tell. The version where I was brave and decisive, and everything worked out with minimal mess. The actual version involves me talking to one of Harker's men for nearly 40 minutes. A young one, younger than I'd first assessed, with the uncomfortable expression of someone who has committed to a position he's no longer certain of and doesn't know how to retreat from with dignity. His name was Curtis, and Curtis had been 3 years with the Harker operation and was clearly aware that this particular enterprise was sitting at the outside edge of what he was comfortable with. But the outer edge of what Curtis was comfortable with still wasn't far enough out to produce active resistance. I talked to Curtis about the law. I talked to him about the territorial marshal and the specific charges required for a hanging and the increasingly complicated position the Harker operation would occupy if a circuit judge came through, and wanted to know where the body was and what proceedings had preceded it. I kept my voice very steady and my face very neutral, and I watched Curtis's discomfort accumulate in the set of his shoulders. I was not brave. I was relentlessly, deliberately reasonable, which in my experience is significantly more unsettling to men like Curtis than anger would have been. Anger they can meet with anger. Reason requires them to think, and thinking is not comfortable when the thing you're thinking about is what you're doing. The second man slept through all of it. I couldn't account for this luck and chose not to examine it closely. Curtis unlocked the outbuilding door. She was sitting cross-legged against the far wall with her hands bound in front of her and the leather bag gone. I noticed the absence of the bag immediately, which tells you something about how specifically I'd cataloged her in my memory. And she looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't make immediate sense, with a scanning attention that is trying to find the category. "Elias Cutter," she said. It was the first time she'd said my name. I noted it in a way that was probably not proportionate to the moment. "We should move quickly," I said. "Why are you here?" "We can." "Why are you here?" Not a question this time. A demand for actual information, delivered in the same flat, precise way she delivered everything. I crouched in front of her so we were at eye level. "Because you were going to die," I said, "and the bowl was there." I used her words deliberately. I watched her face do something complicated. She held out her bound hands. I cut the rope. I'd borrowed Curtis's knife while he was being reasonable at me, a sleight of hand he would probably discover in the morning and hopefully be too embarrassed to report accurately. She rubbed her wrists. She stood. "The bag," she said. "We can't." "The bag," she said again, and there was something in her voice that was different from the flat precision of everything else, something that had weight in it, a weight I didn't understand yet but registered as important. "We got the bag." I don't want to detail exactly how, because it involved more of Curtis's cooperative embarrassment and some quiet negotiation with the sleeping man's lack of consciousness. But we got it. And when she slung it over her shoulder in the dark, outside the outbuilding, she held it for a moment against her chest before settling it, a gesture so brief and private that I almost didn't see it. I saw it. We moved north, away from the settlement, through terrain she navigated with the same uncanny familiarity she'd shown in the creek bed, not fast, but with zero hesitation, which was functionally equivalent to fast in the dark. I followed 2 steps behind and tried not to crash into anything embarrassing. After 20 minutes, she stopped. "They'll look," I said. "Yes," she scanned the darkness around us. "You should go south, back to your work." "Harker's men will." "I know this land," she said. "They do not." This was undeniably true, and I knew it, and I stood there in the dark trying to find a responsible counter-argument and couldn't locate one. She was right. She was almost certainly safer moving through this terrain alone, at speed, without the liability of a range worker who still had occasional balance problems. "The bag," I said. "What's in it that was worth the risk of coming back to the creek?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Seeds, roots, the things I collect." "You were collecting at the creek?" "Yes." "You came back for that, for plants?" "For what the plants become." She adjusted the bag strap. "You ate it." I stood very still. "You understand what I carry," she said. "Then you will know what I am." She looked at me one final time with that look that had no pity in it and no sentimentality and nothing soft. What it had was directness, the specific, personal kind of directness that sees the exact shape of who you are and doesn't look away. "You asked who I really am, that's the answer. I carry the thing that turns into medicine. I carry it from where it grows to where it's needed." She paused. "That's all I've ever been." She walked north. I stood in the dark for a while, listening to my own breathing, writing nothing because I had nothing to write that would have done it justice. Then I went south, toward the settlements, toward the Morning and Aldrich Crane and the version of myself that kept a log and made practical decisions and understood the boundaries of his own business. I went south, and I kept seeing the way she held the bag to her chest in the dark outside that outbuilding, one brief moment of something that wasn't practicality and wasn't performance, just a person holding something essential, making sure it was still there. I did not expect to see her again. Let me be careful about what I mean by that, because expectation and what you find yourself thinking about at 2 in the morning are not the same thing, and I had become, somewhere between the creek bed and the Harker outbuilding, Someone who found himself thinking about clay bowls and the smell of juniper ash in the dark, quiet hours when the bunkhouse was full of other men's sleep sounds, and my own brain refused to be practical. I wrote about her in the log, not dramatically, just the way I write everything, observations, questions, specific details that my brain filed and wouldn't release. The bag held against the chest. The words, "I carry what turns into medicine." The way she'd said my name when I walked through the door, Elias Cutter, with the full name, all of it, as if she'd been holding it carefully in her memory against the possibility of needing to use it. The crane outfit kept me occupied through November with a cattle drive to Wilcox and back that left me too tired for anything except sleep and brief, incoherent log entries about weather and herd behavior. Aldrich Crane, by way of welcoming me back, had assigned me to the worst stretch of the drive, which was his version of expressing relief that I was alive. I chose to receive it as intended. December came, and with it the particular quiet that settles over the territory in winter, when the heat steps back and the land takes a breath and everything seems, briefly, possible. I was riding the eastern fence line on a clear, cold afternoon in mid-December when I saw smoke. Not a fire, a cook fire, the particular thin, controlled plume of a contained fire built by someone who knew what they were doing, rising from the shelter of a rocky overhang about a quarter-mile off the fence line. I noticed it the way I notice most things, by writing about it in my head before I'd made any decision about what to do next. Small fire. Controlled. The smoke isn't billowing. Someone's cooking. I rode toward it. I can offer various practical justifications for this decision. The crane land bordered open territory at the eastern fence, and monitoring unfamiliar activity was legitimately part of range work. It was cold enough that if someone was in trouble, leaving them would have been a moral failure of the kind that follows a man for a long time. I could manufacture the logic retroactively at any required length. The real reason is that I had been thinking about clay bowls for 2 months, and the smoke smelled like something herbal that I couldn't quite name, and that smell reached into my chest before my brain had finished processing it. She was there. She was there, crouching by a small fire over a flat rock she was using as a cooking surface, and she looked up when she heard the horse, and she watched me dismount with the same assessing gaze she'd used the first time, checking my condition before she looked at my face. "You're not sick," she said. "No," I said. "Not this time." She looked at me for a moment longer, then returned her attention to the flat rock. She was pressing something into rounds, thin and dense, the same flatbread I remembered from the creek bed, but with something different in the grain, a yellower color, a different texture. I sat down near the fire without being invited. She didn't ask me to leave. We ate in silence, which was by then a comfortable silence, the kind that requires a history to exist and means you've crossed some threshold where filling every gap with words is no longer required. She produced 2 clay bowls from the leather bag. I watched for it. And yes, it was there, the same worn leather bag over her shoulder, and she handed me one without preamble. This meal was different from the creek bed broth. Thicker, more solid, with visible components. The grain, some kind of dried meat cut very fine. A dark paste made from something I couldn't identify that had a deep, woodsy flavor with a background bitterness that I noticed, and then forgot to keep noticing because the overall experience of the thing was too complete to pick apart. I ate the whole bowl. She watched, then looked away when I caught her watching. "It's the same thing," I said. "The thing I couldn't name in the first bowl, it's here too." She said nothing. "Every time," I said, "there's something underneath everything you make, not an ingredient, the taste of how it was made, maybe, or who made it." She looked at the fire. "What does it taste like?" I thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to take all things. "Patience," I said, finally, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire settled and the cold of the December afternoon pressed in from the edges, and I began to think she wasn't going to respond. Then she said, "My mother taught me." I waited. She was a healer, not medicine in the way you mean that word, but she knew every plant from here to the Gila, what each one did, what each one needed to become what it could be. She turned the empty bowl over in her hands. She said, "You can't hurry the medicine. The medicine knows what it is. You're just the hands that get it from where it grows to where it's needed." "I carry what turns into medicine," I said quietly. She looked at me. "You remembered." I wrote it down. Something happened in her face. Not softness exactly, but a relaxation, like a word held too long on the tongue finally spoken. She died 3 years ago. Winter fever. I had all the plants. I knew all the things she'd taught me. I made the medicine. She stopped. And, I said, though I already knew. And sometimes the medicine knows what it is and what it can do, and it can't do what you need it to do. She set the bowl down very carefully on the flat rock. She died in the night. I held all the plants, and she died in the night. I didn't say anything. I have been in rooms where people say I'm sorry to grief, and I've watched the words land and do nothing and fall away. And I'd promised myself some time ago to stop saying things that land and do nothing. We sat by the fire. After a while she said, I stopped saying my name for 2 years. After she died, it felt like the name was something she gave me. Using it felt like spending something I'd been given and hadn't earned. Saya, I said. She looked at me. Yes. She gave you that name. She gave me everything. She gestured at the bag, at the flat rock, at the bowls. This is all her. I'm just... She stopped, shook her head. I'm just the hands. I've written many things in many logs over many years of range work, and most of them are practical. Weather, wages, herd counts, the particular stupidities and occasional glories of living in close quarters with other men who are all just trying to get through the year. I have written observations and questions, and occasionally late at night, things that would embarrass me in daylight, but that are probably more honest than most of what I say out loud. The entry from that afternoon in December is longer than most. I've read it back more times than is probably healthy. It ends with this. She taught her everything. The woman who died passed all of it forward, the plants, the knowledge, the names for things, and Saya carries it, not for herself. Not for gratitude or payment or any of the transactions I understand. She carries it because that's what you do with something you've been given. You carry it forward to whoever needs it next. That's what I tasted, not patience exactly, more specific than that. The taste of something that has passed through hands, the taste of inheritance. She gave it to me in a creek bed when I was dying, and she didn't know me, and she asked for nothing, because that's what her mother gave her, and now I know who she really is. She is the hands. She let me stay that evening. The fire went down, and the desert night came in cold and sharp, and she rebuilt the fire with the same economy she brought to everything, and we talked, actually talked, more than we had in all the previous time combined. She asked about the crane outfit, about the drive to Wilcox, about the fence line I rode. She asked the way she cooked, with specific attention to what was actually being asked, not small talk but genuine inquiry, wanting to understand the shape of a thing before she placed it. I asked about the plants, about the seeds and roots in the leather bag. She answered in detail I couldn't follow entirely, but that was beautiful to listen to. The specific use of mesquite in treating inflammation, the complicated relationship between chaparral and fever reduction, the way saguaro fruit could be made into something that sustained a person through a 3-day walk if you prepared it correctly. She knew the territory the way a musician knows a piece they've played for decades. Not just the notes, but the space between them, not just what each plant was, but what it was for. I wrote none of this down. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I just listened. At some point in the night, she said, the Harker men found tracks. They followed north for 2 days and then lost me. I assumed. They won't look again. It's not worth their trouble. Good. What you did, she started and then stopped. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to. She looked at the fire. What you did was a risk that wasn't yours to take. You didn't owe me that. The bowl was there, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then, yes. The bowl was there. She left before dawn. I knew she would. I didn't know where she was going, and she didn't tell me, and I didn't ask, because by then I understood that Saya's movements were not random and not disclosed, and were governed by a logic that was as precise and patient as everything else she did, and asking would have been a way of trying to hold onto something that wasn't mine to hold. She was gone when I woke, the fire banked to coals with enough heat remaining to warm my hands before the cold walk back to the horse. The flat rock was clean, no ash where she'd cooked, no impression in the ground where she'd slept. What she'd left was a small clay bowl. Not the one she'd used, a different one, smaller, rougher, clearly old. The kind of object that has been made and repaired and used again, until it carries more history than material. It sat on the flat rock with a small twist of dried herbs beside it, something I recognized by smell even before I touched it, the distinctive, slightly bitter green-brown smell of chaparral, which I now knew treated fever, and which I now knew required specific knowledge to use correctly, and which she had left with me the way you leave something with someone you don't expect to be available to next time they need it. I held it in both hands for a while. There was no note. Of course there was no note. Saya did not pad her meanings with softening words. The bowl was the note. The bowl said, "Here is the medicine. Here is what I carry. Now you carry some of it too." I still have it. In my log on the last page of that particular book, I wrote, "She gave me her name once, tested like a coin. She gave me medicine when I was dying. She gave me a bowl to carry forward. 3 gifts, none of them requested, none of them conditional. The only transaction she'd recognize is this one. You carry it until someone needs it, and then you carry it there. I don't know where she is. I don't know if she'll come through this territory again. The Harker situation may have settled. It may not have. What I know is the smell of chaparral in December. What I know is that the thing I couldn't name tasted like hands that had carried something across years and grief and loss, and kept carrying. I keep a log because I'm afraid of losing things. She keeps a bag because things lost can't be carried forward. We are not so different in our anxieties. We are entirely different in our hands. The following spring I left the crane outfit. There were practical reasons, and there was also a reason I didn't write in the official log, which was that I had been riding the eastern fence line every clear day for 4 months, and looking at a particular rock overhang every time I passed it, and the looking had started to feel like the most honest work I was doing. I went north. Whether I found her, or whether the territory is large enough that a man can go north for a long time with a small clay bowl in his coat pocket, and a chaparral cutting wrapped in a page from his log, and whether finding and being found are the same thing when both people already know where they're going.